I'd gotten used to training these larger, hardier foster dogs. And so the types of techniques I was using prong collars and corrections, most of the dogs were like, okay, I get it. And it seemed to work out well for me most of the time. But then I remember this one foster dog, Arnie was his name. He was a beagle, and it was my first beagle to foster. And I'm thinking, all right, so the same thing's going to work. This dog's pulling. Here, I'm like, you can't sniff because I don't know. I read that in a book somewhere or something. So I was like, all right, I've got to solve this issue of pulling because, to be a better adoption candidate, he should learn how to walk nicely on leash. And so I put a prong collar on him. I go outside and I gave him one correction and he let out the most horrific beagle scream, just clearly telling me that was an awful thing to do. And that moment just clicked something in my brain that just said, okay, something is not right with what I'm doing. Even though I had been so heavily reinforced myself in the past for doing that. I said, well, I can train any dog not to pull on a leash. It's easy. I've done it a million times with a bunch of different dogs. But, it was that moment that shifted me thinking there's got to be another way. Even if it might be harder at first for me to learn, I've got to figure out a different way because Barney was just like, oh, dude, that's not cool. And I said, you're right.
I have a theory that everything we believe about dogs, we learn from someone who was also just guessing. Think about it. The trainer who told us to be the alpha, the uncle who says dogs need to know their place, the TV trainer who advocates for lead corrections, the Instagram reel that made us feel like we were doing it all wrong. None of these people handed us a disclaimer, and none of them said, well, actually, I'm not entirely sure about this. They just said it with confidence, and we filed it away. And then we lived by it. My guest today calls this a life algorithm, the loop of ideas we end up living by without ever really consciously choosing them. And if we're inside a loop like that, our dogs are in there with us. They don't choose any of it, yet their whole life is shaped by what we believe about them. Michael Shikashio has been working with dogs who show aggression for over 25 years. He founded AggressiveDog.com, and he teaches other professionals around the world how to work aggression cases. He's been president of the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants for 5 terms, and in 2020, the Association of Professional Dog Trainers named him their Member of the Year. When outlets like New York Times, the New York Post, and USA Today need someone on dog aggression, they call Michael. This episode is about aggression, but it's really about what our dogs absorb from us. Our anxiety, our certainty, our inherited nonsense, without ever being asked. They've been living by our beliefs their entire lives, and they never got a vote on it. I'm Nadine, and this is Just a Dog Podcast. Let's begin. Hello. Hi, Mike.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Doing well.
I would love to know more of your first introduction into life with dogs and how that led to you working with dogs later on in life.
My parents had brought home a couple dogs. We had one, the first dog named Happy, and they had that lifestyle. The dog was not allowed in the house. So that kind of cultural aspect. And Happy ran away when I was a child. So that was my first experience. And at least that's what they told me. And then the second dog we had, Sarge, looked just like Lassie, if you know that show, Lassie and the collie. And he was sort of indoor, outdoor, but kind of relegated to the basement first floor. Area wasn't allowed in the upstairs. So that was my experience around animals. I had some hamsters when I started to get into my preteens. I was like begging my parents, like, let me just get a pet hamster because I wanted my own pets. That was a good and bad idea because I loved hamsters, but then I got a male and a female hamster. And you know what happens then? It just exploded into this population of, I had like 20 hamsters. I was like, all right, I've got to separate the boys from the girls now because this is a bad idea. So I had hamsters and rabbits and a couple of guinea pigs too in my teenage years. But that was that was as much exposure as I had to animals, and a very old school sort of traditional upbringing around animals. So it wasn't really building a connection with dogs until probably my late 20s when I started fostering dogs. So my ex-wife at the time and myself, we were taking in lots of foster dogs and volunteering for rescues. And that's when I really caught the sort of training and behavior bug and took a real deep dive into helping dogs, because one of the things I found was that a lot of these dogs were given up on, so surrendered to rescue or shelters because of behavior issues. And one of the number one things that you saw as a behavior issue was aggression. So lower levels all the way up to higher levels of aggression. And I thought, what better way to help these dogs, in addition to fostering them to start to learn how to do the training and helping them along the way with the issues they're having. So I took a deep dive into training and into working with aggression, and one thing led to another. And here I am today, just strictly focusing on helping dogs with aggression and their people all around the world. And I'm really fortunate in where things have turned. But if you asked me when I was 10 or 12 years old, what are you going to do when you get older? I would have never, ever thought this at all. It was the doctor or an engineer or a computer scientist, like Asian parents want you to be. And that's totally what my path was supposed to be. But totally different now. So that's a little bit about my background.
So, aggression, gosh, it's such a huge topic because it could be interpreted in so many different ways. What do you think regular dog guardians or dog lovers tend to misunderstand about aggression in dogs?
It's interesting because a lot of people will think it's abnormal behavior or it's bad behavior or there's something wrong or there's something wired wrong with the dog or how dare they do that to me or how dare they bite the hand that feeds them, kind of. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions because aggression is normal behavior. It's undesirable, right? We don't want to get bitten and we certainly don't want for our friends or family to get bitten. But it's normal behavior because when you look at humans, I mean, we use aggression all the time to get a threat away, or if we're fearful of something, or if we're in pain or distress, we do it all the time and we do it at a much higher degree and higher frequency than dogs do. I think dogs are really, really good at not going to aggression. When you think about the number of dogs on the planet versus the number of dog bites that happen or the aggressive incidents you hear about, it is a much smaller percentage than if you look at the amount of aggression, aka violence, in humans. So that's often very misunderstood, and that's the concept I try to have clients as well as the general public understand is that let's look at not the behavior. Sure, we don't like biting, but when we start thinking about why the dogs are biting or having these issues, then we can start to understand and empathize with where they're coming from. And I find that's also a nice practice to do with humans, right? When we start to get to the cause of the behavior. Why is this person yelling at me? Why is this person criticizing me online? Why is this person behaving this way towards me? It's easy to say, it's easy to take offense to it, right? But when we dig deeper and we look at the cause, the root cause, the emotions, the pain, the distress, the trauma, all those things are exactly the same in people as they are in dogs. There's a cause for those things. And that can really help us when we want to help the dogs or help people, right?
I believe there's a connection between perhaps childhood triggers, how we respond to uncertainty with dogs specifically because they cannot communicate and say, oh, I broke my rib and I'm in a lot of pain or whatever. Like we tended to take things personally. So if a dog is misbehaving, communicating, that could be a knee jerk response, as in you're being spiteful or being a bad dog or whatever. What do you see in your experience happening?
Yeah, that's very common because as humans, we like to label things. So the dog is stubborn, the dog is dominant, the dog is willful, the dog is spiteful. But those are all labels that really don't tell us what's going on inside the dog. That's our interpretation of their behavior. And let's face it, dogs don't experience the multitude of in-depth emotions as humans do. Dogs experience the primary and basic emotions for sure: fear, anger, rage, panic, grief. Those kind of are the basic core emotions. But the jury's still out on if they experience some of these other labels that people, they should know better or they look guilty. Those are very common ones. And the dog, let's use that label, the dog looks guilty or the dog was guilty. They knew they weren't supposed to be in the trash or jump up on the counter or something like that. But when we look deeper, we start to realize that dogs actually, they don't say, oh, I'm not supposed to be in this garbage, right? They're not, that's something us humans don't want us to do. But the dog's just looking at that garbage can like, this is a wonderful place to get some leftover treats.
Ooh, those smells.
Yeah. And then so the client or the person gets home from work and they see the trash all over the place and they get upset at their dog, and the dog gives them sort of what they call a guilty look. They put their ears down, they kind of lower their head, they move away. And to the human, it looks like maybe guilt to them, but it's actually the dog simply responding to a facial expression or body language or tone of voice that they've experienced in the past that predicted a negative outcome for them. So if they got yelled at by their guardian or they got punished by their guardian, they're saying in their mind, uh-oh, here we go again. They're going to do that thing to me that they did last time. They don't know it's because they got in the garbage 3 hours earlier, right? They have no way of knowing that because we can't even communicate to them. What are we going to do? Tell them, hey, it's because you got in the garbage 3 hours earlier. No, not at all. So to get back to your question, yes, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around what uh, so that they call that anthropomorphism, right? So assigning human characteristics to dog, yes. And there's some truth to that. I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do think we should do some of that thinking around what dogs might experience similar to humans, but then we also have to do the other side and say what dogs may not experience, even though we want to think they experience that because we're humans. But a lot of times it's an incorrect label, which then can impact the relationship between the dog and the human because the dog's just confused. Like, why are you yelling at me? I don't get it. You just got home from work. I'm excited to see you, but you're yelling at me. And they don't know it's about the garbage, right? So, yeah.
I did a bit of yoga training a while back, and I remember one of the instructors saying that tension exists where there's a miscommunication, and that stuck with me throughout time. Whenever there was any kind of tension, there was always going to be a miscommunication of some sort, and I think that happens quite often with animals because unless you have that skill or that education, it's hard to get through to them and for them to get through to you, and so there's that sticky spot where you're a little bit like, I don't know what you're saying. I don't know what I'm saying. I don't know how to get through to you. I don't know how to get the desired result. Frustration,
There's so much truth to that, Nadine. It's just miscommunication, misunderstanding is something we see all the time when we see tension and conflict and stress, because it's sort of the definition of anxiety when you think about it, is not knowing what the potential outcome in a situation could be. So think about that dynamic as well. And you just look at it everywhere around us right now in this day and age, right? And social media, and certainly with the communications between people and animals, when there's a miscommunication, that's going to bring on the unpredictability, that's going to bring on the unknown, the uncertainty. And especially if there's a history of punishment or conflict or other bad things happening, when you're feeling in that same state of miscommunication or misinterpretation, then that's often in my work when you start to see the aggressive responses, just like we see it in people. They get frustrated. You don't know what you're saying. And fists come out and keyboards start getting hit harder, right? And it's because of the miscommunication, misunderstanding. So that's what I try to impart with my clients, is really helping them understand why their dog is displaying that aggressive behavior. And again, you do the same thing with humans. You come from a place of understanding, then tensions lower, stress lowers, predictability increases, understanding increases, empathy increases. So yeah, it's a lot of what I've been focusing on, and especially in the last decade with working with clients, is just getting them to understand. Because once they do that, they can empathize with the situation.
When you first made that transition from fostering to becoming a trainer, did you have any preconceived ideas about dogs that were surprising that you had to change or adapt on?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's funny because I don't know if you remember the old days of Yahoo groups. Like, it was sort of like the Facebook of today. And after Yahoo groups came like MySpace. And so I'm sort of dating myself here, but yeah, but back then it was a lot of discussion boards, and I would love to be able to get access to some of the old posts I put up, because it would be a good laugh, because I didn't know what I was talking about. It's so many misconceptions, but because in the dog training world back then, there was so much misinformation and misunderstanding and very little science behind things. Things were just kind of passed down from generation to generation, or trainer to trainer. And it was very little was rooted in science or ethics or understanding. So, things like being the alpha. And so I do giggle a little bit about what I used to think versus what I know now. But there really wasn't a lot of information back then. It's much better nowadays, but still we have a long way to go. But yeah, definitely the concepts of like, you have to be the boss, you have to be dominant, dogs need a pack leader, and these kind of misconceptions that are out there. It basically passed on from just a few trainers, and it just kind of exploded. And somewhat, you see it still, people talking like that these days, but I do think we've made a lot of progress in that regard, about getting the education. And that's sort of the silver lining of social media, is that in their information age, is that information does get out there much faster, and I see like these young kids, they're in their 20s and really talented trainers, very knowledgeable at a level that it would have taken me years and years to learn what they know now. But so there is some sort of nice things that have come out of where we are today. But yeah, back then I said a lot of silly things, did a lot of silly things, but we live and learn.
I was speaking to my friend Jenna earlier, and
Mhm.
I was asking her what I could ask you because she works with the public quite often, and so she gets mirrored back some of the ideas or perceptions, especially when it comes to rehoming dogs or aggressive dogs. And a lot of people read aggression not as data but as dominance. Would you mind explaining where that came from and what specifically was inaccurate about it?
Yeah, so dominance comes from ethology. So it is sometimes some trainers like there's no such thing as dominance, but that's not true. Dominance does exist between dogs, between other species, between in some birds, and so it is a thing. And the definition typically is priority access to a resource. So one animal will use behavior directed at another animal to get access to something, and people do it all the time. It could be a couple of guys at the bar and they both want a seat at the bar and they kind of look at each other. So nobody's punching, nobody's pulling out a gun or a knife. They just kind of give each one guy gives the other a look and he's like, that's my chair. And the other guy's like, okay, you could define that as a dominant behavior. But what their misconception comes into is that when we start to label a human or a dog or any other animal as a dominant animal, a dominant dog, dominant human, they're not always going to be like that. It's in the moment, it's in the context. So that guy at the bar could say, that's my seat there. But then they go outside and they're like, oh, that's my car there. So it's fluid. It changes depending on the context and the situation. So it's basically behavior used to get access to something like a resource. So where it became problematic, though, and by the way, this a lot of was derived from studies of captive wolves, and you had the alpha wolf, and they said, oh, that alpha wolf's in charge, but that really got pulled into the dog training world in a sort of a erroneous way because it meant you must punish the lower ranking members, you must punish the dog, you must use force or other corrections to get this dog in line because you should be the alpha, you should be the dominant one. But when you look at when dominance is used, they actually aren't using any kind of aggressive responses or any kind of punishment. It's more communication between both animals. So what happened was that people started to use punishment, like, oh, I have to use force and corrections and pin the dog down on their back and all these things that can actually increase aggression. Because I know if I'm getting pushed around and kicked and punched all the time, I'm going to become aggressive at some point, to defend myself. So that started to get drawn into dog training in the dog training world, being like, you have to do this or this or this to get the dog to submit because you are the alpha. And we know, of course, the potential risk of doing that because it can increase aggression in many cases. Doesn't always, but it can. And it's something that's a high risk to try to do. For me, of course, I'm working on using reinforcement and teaching the dog what I want to do instead, and forming a relationship with the dog that's built on trust and not punishment. And that's where much of modern training has gone today. And that's important because some folks still follow that dominance or alpha model, which is unfortunate for the dogs that experience that.
I recently started fostering Duna. She's a Galga. And she's 7 years old, amazing dog, super gentle, zero issues whatsoever. Obviously, separation anxiety and a whole host of other bits and bobs. But when I first got her, there was an expectation that she needs to fit into my world, that she needs to adapt. I need to train her and show her the lay of the land. And thankfully, I had really amazing people around me in the rescue space who were like, no, she doesn't need training. She needs safety. She needs a space to decompress. She needs someone who is calm and kind and understanding to create that environment for her. It's not like people would just go out of their way to go and learn about dogs if they don't have them. But the experience was extremely eye-opening for me, and I realized there was still a long way to go. Seeing how people understood and treated dogs, which was the most surprising thing for me about fostering.
Yeah, there's a lot of unfortunately, I wouldn't call them myths, but misnomers in that sense because every dog's going to be different. And some dogs, as we know, they come right in. I foster some dogs and they're like, oh, and they just go pick a corner or a couch to lay on and they're totally fine. And some dogs need time to adapt. And so there's different suggestions out there. One is called like the 3-3-3 rule: 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, and in terms of the dog settling in, which isn't a bad guideline, but each dog's going to be different. So we have to be flexible in that. Analogy I use all the time is that when we have a dog coming into a home, it's just like a person moving to another country. So if they move from one town in their country to the next, it's not going to be that different. But many times in rescue and foster, the dogs are coming to a significantly different environment. And that's happening much more so these days when we have dogs coming from, well, in Europe and in your area, also UK, there's dogs, I'm sure, coming from Spain and the Middle East and some of those countries, Cyprus. And so different areas in the US, we have a lot of dogs coming up from the South, so more rural areas up into New York City or Boston or some of these big cities. And when you think about it, when you're a dog and all of your life experience in the first 6 months or a year or 2 years, however old the foster dog is, has been in that environment. They know that rural area where there's lots of frogs or there's lots of trees of a certain kind, there's lots of open space. And suddenly, in the name of rescue, somebody gets the dog, puts them in a shelter for a few days because they have to get their shots and all that and checked out. And then they get put on a transport and they get shipped up, 1,000 miles north, scary long ride. And then somebody comes, picks them up in a parking lot and then go to an apartment in New York City. That's a 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom. Maybe it's a studio apartment with all these loud noises and tall buildings and people everywhere and dogs and garbage trucks and everything. Think about how much of a change that is. It's just like if a person has never traveled their whole life and they've just spent their whole entire up until their teenage years at a farm with a couple ducks and chickens and cows or something like that. They've never seen a building. They've never heard a bus. They've never seen that. And we take them and we put them in Tokyo or something. It is a profoundly different experience. So that kind of dog or person is going to need much more time to acclimate. They're going to need to learn, what is this sound? What does that letter mean? What does this, bus do? What is that loud motorcycle thing? And so when we're adapting dogs to environments, especially foster dogs, some can take time and they need time. And that's why I always like to remain flexible, because some dogs need a quiet, safe space in the home, right? Just like this is my little corner with my little X pen around it, my soft, comfy bed and my toys and treats. And I'm going to stay here for a few days until I can hear things and just feel safer. And then some dogs need much more open access because suddenly it's like they've been snatched from some area and put in like a little jail cell in somebody's home, right? Because somebody's told them, oh, they need a confined space, crating and all those things. So it always boils down to ask the dog, what are you looking for? Do you want to go for these long hikes now, or do you need some time? And of course, that takes a little experience, being able to read dog body language and behavior, but the dogs can always tell you what they want. And if you go at their pace, that's going to build a lot more safety, a lot more trust in the relationship. I did want to mention that because, if anybody's fostering, there's no hard set rule. You have to do X, Y, or Z in any set order. The dog's always going to tell you what they need.
I've learned that some of the ideas that the people that I have come across that they've learned from TV trainers. They've learned from people with very large followings on social media. I'd never heard of someone called Dog Daddy before. And so someone said, oh, you need to go on there and check. He says do X, Y, Z. And so I did. And I was like, ooh, this does not make me feel good. Even if someone with 1 million followers with all the credentials in the world says, push your dog off a cliff, does that feel? And so I try and tune into if that feels right to me. And that helps me decide ultimately.
That's such a good point, because I think that's a good way. It's a good safeguard when it comes to what kind of information you're going to use in your daily routine or life, because that's the design of social media much of the time, is to provide these before and after, like, wow, that's amazing. Or especially with somebody like the Dog Daddy, it's man versus beast. And it's like, look at him handle these vicious dogs. And it can look great on camera because you see this before and after sort of. But if you're not aware of what dog body language or dogs communicating through body language or not, maybe not familiar with dog behavior, it's going to look great. But when you start to look at the dog body language and you start to then layer that in with what you're just saying, your principles and your ethics, that's an important lens to look through with anything, right? With when it comes to diet or exercise or all these other gurus we see on social media, we should always question ourselves like, is this does this align with my principles, my ethics? Does it make sense? It looks great, but that before and after weight loss or is it healthy to do that? Is it safe for that person? Is it going to be safe for me? And so I think things that they should teach kids in school these days, right? How to use safeguards and how to use critical thought, really. It's unfortunately starting to become a lost art.
Yeah, yeah. When it comes to dogs, putting dogs from other countries in a completely new environment, and then locally having either high performance, high drive dogs bred for specific jobs in urban environments, all of a sudden in apartments and things like that. I just saw today, and I'm so glad I took a screenshot of this because there was this I'll show you a picture. I don't know if you can see that. It's an Alaskan Malamute in a crate, having torn up its entire bed. Person was before and after I came back from work. So this poor dog, Malamute, has been in their crate for 8 hours. And some people are just giving advice and they're just like, oh, you're doing crating wrong. And I'm just like, surely that's not it.
Yeah, yeah. It's unfortunate because that a lot of times like they get upset at the dog, right? And we would never get upset at someone we love if they're distressed in a certain situation. At least we hope they don't. But that's often an indicator the dog's in very distressed or bored. Sometimes they do destroy things because they need to do something. I mean, it is a long time to be confined. So, yeah, I see that often where there's so much going back to misinterpretation and miscommunication. And it kind of saddens me when I see dogs get punished for something that's quite normal for them to do, right? Or it's just like a human getting yelled at or punished for, biting their nails when they're nervous, right? It's their way of coping with something that's driven by anxiety. Again, that underlying reason for the behavior. So once we understand it, then we can come home and be like, oh, you chewed up your dog bed. Let me figure out what's going on. Do we need to give you more space? Do we need to give you other things to chew on? Do we need to maybe have less time alone because you have separation distress or anxiety? And so looking at the root causes is going to help us not yell at the dog for doing something quite normal, although it might seem abnormal, again, to a lot of humans.
I find it so interesting. There's so many underlying factors, and it really just takes a human to not be defensive and to really want to look and to really want to see, to be able to pick up on those cues and treat the aggression as they're trying to tell you something. What are some of the foundations or like the basics that a dog needs to live an optimal life? I know that there are like the 5 freedoms. In your experience, what would an optimal life look like for a dog?
Yeah, I think I'll speak from the aggression lens, meaning because of the work I do. And the number one thing is safety. Safety is going to override everything else and that's from a physiological, biological, evolutionary standpoint as well. So when we are in fight or flight mode because we are feeling threatened by something, that overrides hunger, right? Because our systems prime themselves to escape. We're not worried about digesting, lunch. We are then going into, I need to get away from this thing that might kill me or eat me. Safety is the most important thing for everyone, or for all species. It's most important. So that's the number one thing that sometimes gets missed because sometimes we think of overt safety, don't get in the dog's face and scare the dog or keep them away from the loud noises and things like that. Yes, very important. But we sometimes have to think at a sort of the mid-level or even micro level. It can be just exposures to loud noises at a distance, but it's all day long. Or it could be they're in a noisy apartment building with lots of construction going on for weeks at a time. That can erode their safety. That can increase their stress. And we also know about chronic stress, distress, where it can be detrimental to health. So safety can have implications on so many other things because we talk about health, the Brambles 5 freedoms, access to or freedom of from sickness and things like that to keep the dog healthy. But if the dog's not feeling safe long term, that's going to impact their health. So I would say safety, definitely number one. I think number two is quality of life. That's technically, can be intertwined with the five freedoms or some of the other welfare models out there. But I do think, how do we assess that properly? Because we all talk about, yeah, good welfare, good standards. Yeah, yeah, quality of life. But what does that look like? And each dog is going to be different, just like each human. But a lot of that for me is just access to nature, access to things that the dog can explore. And the dog's going to go back to telling you what they like. So if it's a foster dog or a new dog, or somebody, one of your listeners is just getting a dog, go out there and try things just like we would with our kids, right? We're gonna try a lot of different things to see what they enjoy, what they like to explore, what they like to play with. Do they like to play? Are they more solo and just like to sniff in the woods? Are they more into running with you? Are they more into playing with you directly? Is it without toys even? So what do they like to do? And I think that will also allow you measurements of quality of life, because if a dog's like, all right, we're going to go for this 1 mile run, and you got like an English bulldog or something that's like, I don't like running at all. And you might think, oh, that's a great quality of life, right? Because I read it in a book, I saw it online, I saw an Instagram meme about exercise and quality of running and movement and things like that. And we don't ask the dog. That's not good quality of life. We think it is, just like sometimes welfare standards are like what we think as humans, but it really is about the dogs telling us. Just like with people, we're going to ask them, what's good quality of life for you? What do you like to do? So that's probably number two on my list, is in terms of avoiding aggression. In a lot of cases, if you just do those two things, you don't have to do any training or fancy behavior change strategies. You just provide good quality of life, meaning the dog gets plenty of exercise and enrichment and stimulation and gets to be a dog as we've intended, as Mother Nature's intended and evolution is intended, not what we as humans in the last 50 years have tried to intend. And then safety. So when a dog's feeling safe, they don't need to resort to aggression. Like, what's the point, right? If I'm feeling safe, I'm not feeling threatened, I don't need to use aggression. So, and of course, quality of life is going to mean they get the nutrition and water and all those things as well. But so they don't have to compete for those resources or resource guard, right? Or show aggression around resources. So if you do those two things many, many times, you don't have to do much else, right? With the exception, of course, like pain, underlying pain issues, but that all falls into the welfare models and quality of life as well, of course. And I should mention that because from an aggression lens, pain is one of the most underdiagnosed reason for aggression. And so if anybody experiencing aggression issues with their dog, when in doubt, get a full checkup, not just I'm going to take the dog to a vet for a quick look, go in and it's best to rule out those issues, because you can hire the best trainer in the world and spend tens of thousands of dollars if you want, and you are not going to change anything if the dog's in pain. And the reason for the aggression is the pain. So, just this little side note there
Yeah,
to be
and
sure.
it's important as well because, like, let's say, for example, like the dog is showing aggression and you try
Mhm.
and manage it on your own. All the stories I've heard, people try and manage it on their own. They get to a point where they're so frustrated and so desperate
Yeah.
that they end up looking for a faster solution. And the faster solutions tend to come from trainers with a certain philosophy.
Mhm.
And so applying pain on pain ultimately is awful. It's just, I can't imagine anything worse for the welfare of the dog,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. And that's the unfortunate thing, because dogs cannot speak. They can't tell us, unless you're good at reading their communications. You have to speak dog to really see that. And, the worst cases for me is when I see, I'll go in and the clients and they've tried a lot of things and they're just listening to another trainer's advice. So it's like the milligram experiment, right? Where it's just, oh yeah, I'm going to shock the other person because the professional's telling me to do so. And so same thing can happen at home. So the person's just trying to stop the behavior. And I don't blame them. They're doing the best they can with the information they have, right? They think this is the best thing because a professional told them to do so. But they might be using whatever training tool or device that causes the dog pain. And the worst case for me, when I see the dog is already in pain and they're just trying to communicate, hey, please don't touch me when I'm trying to rest on my dog bed here. Can you please keep the children away from me because they keep jumping on my hip that I have hip dysplasia with, or and it's ouch, and they're growling or they're snarling or whatever to communicate they're in pain. And then the client, the guardian's just like, No, you don't. I'm going to rip you off your dog bed and tell you no and use a correction. And now the dog's in more pain. And what a travesty, because if you think about that, if we were to do that to any human or child, it would be awful. And most of the time illegal. But dogs, unfortunately, don't get that pass. They get misunderstood because they can't tell us what they're doing. So that's why, again, a good professional is going to be the interpreter, right? They're going to interpret that dog's communication for their guardian so they can then understand. Again, going back to the underlying reason for the aggressive responses. So yeah, pain is a big one. I've been on that for the last very heavily trying to push that message out there for the last few years because I just see so many tragic cases because the dog's not diagnosed correctly.
A lot of rehoming as well
Mhm.
because people get scared. It's like all of a sudden the dog was snarling or barking or like lunging at me or snapping and then you just think, okay, it didn't happen overnight. There were lots of cues that you potentially missed there.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's a sad scenario when you come upon it, but it is. I guess the silver lining to it is that you feel grateful when the clients do finally understand, and you've helped the client and their dog, and you've repaired their relationship, and you've gotten the dog some help. And sometimes, because when people think training, dog training, they think sit down, stay calm. I'm going to teach my dog tricks and things like that. How I work is much different, or really anybody doing aggression cases is going to work much differently. So it's not a lot of sit down, stay calm. I can literally go into some homes and just figure out what's going on. I don't do any training, like zero. There's no sit down, stay, treats, or anything. It is just saying, your dog's in pain. Let's get it to the vet. Let's take care of that issue. Here's what you're going to do to not bother your dog while they're in pain for now. Here's what you can change in your approach. Then here's the signals and the communication your dog's going to give you. And the case is solved, right? So we don't have to do anything else. So it's a lot different kind of work that we often do in aggression cases, but it's also very rewarding, when you find those cases that something that's all you have to do. And it's an easy fix in our mind, but it's not so easy when the client's confronted with that. You mentioned frustration. You mentioned, there's so many emotions on the human side: frustration, anger, fear, guilt, distrust. There's so many things that come into play. And another thing I say in my work is that if you want to get into, if you're a dog trainer and you want to get into working aggression cases, you have to love people and you have to love working with people. Because a lot of people get into dog training because they love dogs and maybe they don't like people so much. Like, if you want to work with aggression cases, you gotta love people. The dogs actually become the easy part because most of the aggression cases are very similar, but it's really all about the people, getting them to understand. You're going to see so many different emotions. You have to be able to empathize and be compassionate. You can't judge them for what they're just trying to do to stop it. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things I've learned over the last, decade or so working with people, so many thousands of people. Fascinating the human side of these cases.
I wonder what percentage, roughly, of trainers actually train the humans, as in, like, what percentage is human training and what percentage would be dog training?
Yeah, I think it depends. So, for instance, if you're doing service dog, like you're training service dogs, rarely. I would say it's like 95%, 5%. I could be way off because I don't do service dog training, but obviously there's a lot more the trainer training the dog to do this work for many, many hours, sometimes years, or working dog type situations. Sport dog trainers as well may not be necessarily having to get into the deep emotions of the people they're working with. So it can, you start to see a little bit more higher percentages in the people, but nothing near as close to like with aggression cases or behavior cases. Separation anxiety cases are another example. It's probably 90% with the humans, showing them what to do, maybe 10% with the dogs, or even my wife, who's a veterinarian, she works with separation anxiety cases, and it's more 100 and 0. Like, she sees the dog, but she actually never meets the dog because all of the work is done online. And that's actually the best way to do separation anxiety cases. So the trainer's not becoming part of the distraction or the departure cues, they call it, when the person leaves the home. And the trainer can actually kind of mess things up if they're there. So it's better if they're not there. And so she actually never meets the dog. So it's really, when you think about it, 100% she's working with the people. And so, yeah, I think it depends what kind of training. There's lots of different types of training, lots of different areas we can go into and specialize in. So, yeah, but yeah, most times when you have issues, whether it's dogs pulling on leash, dogs jumping up on the counter, dogs showing aggression, separation anxiety, it's the good percentage is the people. You're training the people how to live with and work with their dog. Yeah.
It's actually easily fixable, right? But how often do you see things like shame stopping people from finding solutions for their animals?
Mm. I hear that that's come out of them. Of course, after I start working with them, they were like, oh, I was really embarrassed, or I was like, I don't know, maybe it was something I was doing, or I did something wrong, or I made a mistake. And so you do hear that emotion, that underlying worry, and that's very common. When we have that uncertainty about what's going on, and we're going to blame, we have a lot of self doubt, self blame. So, not uncommon at all. And then that is, there are some people that they just won't reach out for professional help because they're just so embarrassed, or they don't want to tell anybody, or they don't want to show anybody they made a mistake. And I always tell people, again, we're all just doing the best we can with the information we have, right? So we all can make mistakes, and we all can look back, and just like me, when I first started up, I did a lot of stupid things, and it just, we learn, we grow. So, and that's the other part of it too, right? In life, when we can recognize that, right, those mistakes, then the shame dissipates, the embarrassment can dissipate, because we can look back and say, haha, I did those things, but I also grew out of that. So yeah.
Thankfully. I
Yeah.
read somewhere that you were a crossover trainer. Do you feel comfortable talking about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that kind of falls into the picture of mistakes I made. So crossover trainer, for those that don't know, is somebody that started using aversives. Aversives can be defined as things like prong collars, or electronic training collars, choke chains, other aversives or punishers, they call it. It's things that are the dog finds uncomfortable or painful. So I started out using those things, and in fact, I was very heavy handed when I first started, and this is going back about 25 years now. And a lot of the training was like that. And some still is today, but that's what I was exposed to. And it's interesting because that's talks a lot about culture and your surroundings and your environment. Because I actually didn't know any of the positive training existed at the time. I never heard of it. I never heard of clicker training. It was out there, and it was readily out there. And that's another thing that drives me crazy too, is when people say, "Oh, they should know better." Like, when talking about trainers, like, all this information is out there, but it's not really, unless you're in that environment. It's the life algorithm at the time that I was in. There's people like Caesar Milan were around, and that's what I was exposed to. That was my life algorithm. So that's what my algorithm kept feeding me. So I joined Yahoo groups that were like, that was my algorithm, because that's all I learned about. I never heard of the other names. And finally, it's like one day you're on your Instagram feed and you get a different kind of post that's from somebody else you don't follow, but it's a suggested for you kind of thing. That's what happened to me in one of the Yahoo groups. A couple of trainer groups. Some people were very nasty to me for what I was doing, but I was like, why are you being, this is how everybody trains. So they're like, no, it's not. But a couple of mentors at the time kind of took me under their wings, saying, there's some alternative methods here you can use. Check these out. If you're interested, happy to teach you. I'm like, okay, I'll check it out. And I started to learn about alternative techniques, positive reinforcement. And I started to get into that algorithm. So that's what started coming across my life feed at the time. So I'm like, oh, this book, or this group, or this article, and this seminar, this conference. And then I started to really get myself to that world. And it took some time for me to change. That kind of shift doesn't happen in one day. You can take a couple years, but over time I started to go with the mindset of, what can I do in this particular situation or case that's going to use positive reinforcement instead of what I'm used to and know how to do? Because I can get a dog to stop jumping, lunging, barking, growling, biting. I can get them to stop that quite well, because punishment does work, and aversives work really well and quickly if you know how to use them. But that's not addressing the underlying issue, right? We can stop a dog from biting, but that doesn't make them less fearful. We need to help them feel safer, and address the fear, so the dog doesn't have the need to go to that biting behavior I'm trying to punish in the first place. So once I had that sort of paradigm shift in my head, that really helped me say, okay, that's what I'm going to keep doing. Like, what can I replace my old technique with a new technique? I have to get good at those new techniques, but that can happen over time. So over time, that shifted, and it became how I train now, which is, of course, positive reinforcement based approaches to helping dogs with aggression issues. But I always told myself also, because I had some really great mentors early on, one of them, Barbara Brill, who passed away about 5 years ago. I promised myself that she's one of the ones that really helped me shift. And I promised myself, I'm going to do the same. because I can choose a path. I can be one of those nasty people that's like, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're doing. You got to stop punishing dogs. Or I can say, hey, you're on a journey here. If you're interested, happy to show you what I do. No judgment. I understand you're probably still going to keep using those tools for a while, and you may still continue to use those tools forever. However, what can I show you that might replace some of those moments, right? It's like planting seeds that eventually grow, and that some trainers really shift. They become very good at the positive reinforcement aspects of training and in life, or they can sometimes go the other direction. So yeah, some good lessons learned in that crossover journey for sure. Not only with the dogs, but how to navigate conversations with people and help shift people's mindset without violence or conflict, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much of that philosophy was tied to your identity at the time, and how much of a
Mm.
shift did that take for you to see yourself in a different way?
Yeah, good question. Because I think growing up, I was the one like the town I grew up in is North Providence, Rhode Island. Is a small, not a small town, but mid-sized suburban town, and it was mostly Italian and Irish kids I was growing up with. It was me, one other kid. He was Chinese. I'm Japanese. There was one Chinese kid, one Colombian kid, one Saudi Arabian Lebanese kid, and one Indian kid that we all. The five of us hung out all the time. So we were like that odd group. But of course, the bullying was rampant, like really bad bullying I experienced when I was a kid. And so I started to get into martial arts and for self defense and things like that. So early on, I learned that. And I got in a lot of fights, lots and lots of fights when I was a kid. So I kind of learned, violence is the answer to solving your problems, even if it's in the name of self defense. But, when you're a teenager, preteen, teenager, in those days, especially settling things was with your fists or, at least boys. I learned that kind of affected my mindset. It's like, all right, solving problems with dogs, same thing must be, right? You got to just like correct it and be victorious, be the stronger one with better technique, and you'll be victorious. So that really did, and it's not. I don't think I would just attribute it to that. Of course, it's cultural. The U.S. society is very heavily punishment based system, but I did. I think so many of those influences in my culture, the cultural aspect of living in the U.S., growing up in the U.S., influenced how much I worked with dogs in that same way. And so it took some time, and parented in the same way too. I wasn't like a heavy handed like parent or anything, but I would yell and do things when I was a young parent that I really shifted over the years because dog training helped with that, right? It allowed me to see a different side of how we can change behavior in not only dogs, but in humans as well. So using positive reinforcement and empathy, understanding, getting to the root of the behavior cause, the behaviors we're seeing that we find undesirable was all part of this shift. So that I think, from my childhood and then what I thought was this is how you do it, right? This is everybody else is doing it. Well, I guess this is how you do it. And to being exposed to other things and some really great mentors and teachers, and then just applying that to everything else in life. It's, yeah. So dog training for me has been influential in not just the work I do with the aggression, but just so many other aspects of life and so many other things I do now. So I couldn't have wished for a better career to fall into because I could have gotten to a lot of other things, right? But for some reason I'm here. So,
Well, it's clearly made you a better human being, which is just so incredible, isn't it? Like when you think about
it's
how dogs are just the perfect teachers, really.
absolutely. Absolutely. And some dogs have taught me so much. One of my first moments was I was fostering. This is when I was first starting to train. And I used to foster a lot of Labrador retrievers, like big blockheaded and field labs. So field labs in the US, they're like those tall, lankier labs, but they are hardy. Like they will run through the icy water, pricker bushes. Like they are not like chihuahuas shivering in the 60-degree weather. They will go. And so I'd gotten used to training those kind of dogs, some Dobermans. I had a lot of like these larger kind of hardier foster dogs, if I'm going to put a label on them. And so the types of techniques I was using prong collars and corrections, most of the dogs were like, okay, I get it. And it seemed to work out well for me most of the time. But then I remember this one foster dog, Barney was his name. He was a beagle. And, it was my first beagle to foster. And I'm thinking, all right, so the same thing's going to work. This dog's pulling. And here I'm the idiot that's like, okay, this dog's trying to sniff. It's a beagle, right? I'm like, talk about not allowing for quality of life and their needs met. And here I'm like, you can't sniff because I don't know. I read that in a book somewhere or something. So, yeah. So I was like, all right, I've got to solve this issue of pulling because, to be a better adoption candidate, he should learn how to walk nicely on leash. And so I put a prong collar on him. I go outside and I gave him one correction and he let out the most horrific beagle scream, just clearly telling me that was an awful thing to do. And that moment just clicked something in my brain that just said, okay, something is not right with what I'm doing. Even though I had been so heavily reinforced myself in the past for doing that. And said, well, I can train any dog not to pull on a leash. It's easy. I've done it a million times with a bunch of different dogs. But it was that moment that shifted me thinking there's got to be another way. Even if it might be harder at first for me to learn, I've got to figure out a different way because Barney was just like, dude, that's not cool. And I said, you're right. Let me figure something out. And so I started my journey into the positive reinforcement side of things. So yeah. Yeah, dogs. He taught me a lot among many other dogs I've worked with, but he was definitely a teacher for me.
I had a balanced trainer on the podcast a couple of months ago, and it was a very open conversation. And
Mhm.
I'm open to having conversations where, let's just learn from each other, because I'm trying to understand the psychology, as in like what makes you feel that this is the best way,
Mhm.
right? And the reason why I asked those questions was because as a pet parent, it's very confusing. Like, you're hearing things from all different angles. And the conversation I had with him, I have to admit, I would never, but I recognize he's extremely convincing.
Mhm.
Everything from data, he was an excellent orator, like just so convincing in so many ways. And I believe truly that he believes truly that his way is the best and kindest way. He was basically saying that a lot of the data that other people quote when they reference this science
Mhm.
doesn't include extreme cases. They include regular pets and smaller numbers. And so the research isn't there to justify what they have seen to be true and accurate in
Mhm.
the real world. And that kind of stuck with me because I thought, I know there are people like yourself who are force free and you do deal with extreme cases. So how are you successful in that if the other camp believes that there is no other way?
Yeah, I think to start, we should clarify the labels there. So, again, if the listeners aren't familiar with these terms, balanced trainers, the term balanced trainers generally means somebody that will use an aversive tool or technique. That can be from time to time. That can be a lot. That can be infrequently. And so it's an unfortunate label because the folks that I've met that might be labeled as balanced or ascribed to that label can fall into a very wide spectrum. And the same thing for that term force free trainer. So force free trainer would, or positive only, which is actually a misnomer because there's no trainer that can be positive only because no matter what we do, the punishment can be involved. And punishment doesn't mean like what people think, like hitting the dog or yelling at the dog. It could be simply removing a treat. The dog jumps up and I go like, no, you can't have that because you jumped up. That's technically a punisher in the scientific sense. So I just wanted to clarify that. So force-free trainers tend to be labeled as somebody that doesn't use something like a prong collar, electric collar, or choke chain, something like that. And then you even have a spectrum in there because some force-free trainers might say, okay, I'm going to block the dog from running out the door into traffic, right? So they might just step in front of the dog. That technically is an aversive stimulus. You're preventing that. So you're putting your body there. That could be construed as punishment. So that is also not necessarily completely positive only, but it seems benign because who hasn't stepped in front of their dog? They don't want them jumping up on grandma or jumping out in the street, right? So I just wanted to clarify that for the discussion's sake. I think labels can be divisive in the industry because if you really look at a good percentage of the trainers, many of them are doing the same thing, right? The exception is maybe they don't use certain tools, but it's the dog that determines what's aversive. So some dogs might consider a body block the worst thing in the planet, or you pulling a treat away, like death is going to come upon them for you doing that. And then some dogs, you can put an electronic collar on and put it on full blast. And they're like, aha, that tickles. Right. And so obviously I'm making extreme examples there, but I just wanted to put that out there, especially for any trainers listening in. I think that we have to be succinct with our definitions of the different types of trainers out there. So yeah, the other question is, the other conundrum that comes up is, or the argument I should say is, let's see some force-free trainers or positive only trainers work with the severe aggression cases sort of as a measuring stick of like, okay, if you can work with those cases, great. But the issue with that is, how do you really measure success? Because if it's aggression is normal behavior, meaning you don't ever remove it from animals' repertoire. So if I was like, Nadine, I'm going to have some guys jump out at you on the street and attack you, and you're going to punch them in the face as defense, and that's going to work for you, right? So, but I'm going to give you a positive reinforcement program, say, okay, we're going to reward you with $1 million every time you don't punch the next guy in the face. You'll be like, all right, I could probably do that. And maybe you'll just deal with the attacker or talk nicely or whatever, something that works for you. But that doesn't eradicate what you know how to do. 10 years from now, somebody could have come out and attack you and you might punch them in the face because that works. So there's no way of telling somebody this technique fixed the issue. And that's the operative word there. Fixed it, eliminated it, solved it. You never do with aggression because it's normal behavior. We don't remove that out of any animal's repertoire if they want to live. So that fight, flight response, it's innate. It's innate in all of us. And so to use that as a measuring stick is a problem because there's no way of knowing for sure. You can make it look good on camera, right? I could get a dog like the dog daddy and use that technique and get the dog to stop trying to bite and lunge using punishment. Or I could give the dog a treat from a distance when it doesn't bite and lunge, when it sees a person from a distance. And it's all going to look good on camera, but that's only one snapshot in time. There's no way of measuring if something's truly going to be successful when it comes to aggression. Now we can get into the nitty gritty, be like, okay, some of the other types of training, we could say, okay, let's teach dogs how to sit. Which camp can get a dog to sit faster in the kitchen? All right. And so you might have contests like that one, but with aggression cases that you can't because it's normal behavior. Now, the other thing to think about is when it comes to aggression cases, the aggressive behavior of the dog is just a minimal part of the entire situation. And so an example could be like, let's take the same dog and we'll get a couple trainers, all right, let's do it like this way. You take two litter mates, identical in every way. They've been raised the same and they're showing the same high level of aggression. Let's take one and give it to the force-free trainer, or take one and give it to the balance trainer. See who can solve or get the best progress with that client in 3 months, right? But now you have one dog goes to a home with 5 kids, single parent, working a full-time job, no fenced-in yard, 1-bedroom apartment, that kind of environment. You go to the other home, they have millions of dollars to spend, they have all the free time, 2 adults only living in the home, lots of fenced-in area, plenty of enrichment opportunities, the best vet care, right? And you could take which trainer's going to take which one, because one's going to have a lot harder time than the other. So it's important to consider that. And that's just the dog part of things in the environment. What about the people? So you get that trainer, be like, okay, you've got Mrs. Jones and single mom, and she's not dedicated at all to this plan. She's too busy. She still likes to go out to the clubs drinking at night, and she's not into this dog training thing at all. But you still got to train this dog to success within 3 months. The other trainer's got the fabulous couple, completely dedicated. They have a background in psychology. They are 100% on board. They keep data on spreadsheets. So you have, again, another variable in that case. So it is going to be impossible to say which side's going to be better because of the variables involved. Where you can start to compare things is in those incidental, like a lot of the research is done on incidental studies, like a recall or getting a dog to do some task faster than the other. But when it comes to aggression cases, there's just no way to measure what's going to be better. It all boils down to the unique situation. And I think that's where a lot of the arguments come from. It's just like, who's going to be better? It's dependent on the situation, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a shame, really, because ultimately we just want solutions, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. The average dog guardian's not going to know the difference. That they've never heard of balanced or force-free. And the only people yelling about it at each other is the trainers. And the people that do fall into the dog training world that see that, like the the guardians that just need help for their dog. It just creates more confusion. And I keep telling the industry as much as I can, do we want to become an industry that's looked on as like one of those, when you think about it, like a sleazy profession? I won't name any because I don't want to insult anybody, but you think about like a sleazy profession, you're like, oh, that person's a such and such, and you kind of have that look. That's what's going to happen to dog training soon, because all they do is see us fighting with each other all the time. And who's better than this and who does what. And even worse now, we're seeing even much more nefarious behavior happening between trainers. And that's a travesty because we're all looking to help dogs. We just have different ways of approaching it. And it's just becoming more divisive because everybody's fighting with each other about what works best. They all work, or else they wouldn't be in business. And I've done both. I know both work. The end of the day, for me at least, the question I ask is, what can I do to ensure I'm being as kind with the dog and people as possible? And if you just use that as your underlying mission the whole time, that's going to shift you in the right direction. So whether you still are a balanced trainer, as long as you keep that, what can I do to ensure I'm being as kind as possible to this dog? That'll keep allowing you to question what you're doing, allowing you to get better, and ignoring all the noise while still maybe using certain tools once in a while or whatever. That maybe you're using that tool less or less extensively or less intensively, right? So, yeah.
Ultimately, yeah, it's that tuning in and kind of checking in with yourself and like, how do I feel? Because ultimately, and I'm not saying that dogs are children, but I don't know. But for me, it's like, if I wouldn't do it to a kid, I wouldn't do it to a dog.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it's good to follow that. Yeah. Some people argue too, like, oh, would you put your kid in a crate? Would you allow your kid to pee outside? Would you allow your kid to eat out of a food bowl on the floor? Like there's all these arguments that I hear in the dog training community. They start to really like, and then the other side of arguments sometimes you hear is like, all right, if you can train a mountain lion to stick their hip up to a cage and get a blood draw, you can certainly do that with a dog. But, mountain lions are also in that kind of environment are captive animals, and we have protective contact, and we're not inviting them to sleep next to us on our bed. So there's always going to be holes in the arguments.
Yeah, I totally forgot about this. Yeah, it seems so obvious to me. If I wouldn't do it to a child, I wouldn't. Yeah, but I'm not going to make my child eat from a bowl on the floor either. But
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
okay, I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so funny how these things work. But yeah, humans will be humans. In your experience, when dog guardians start recognizing certain behaviors, undesirable behaviors in their dogs, what should they do? What should they look out for? And when is an appropriate time to take action?
The appropriate time is right away in terms of hiring a professional if you're worried about aggression issues or if you've seen aggression issues, because it becomes more difficult once the dog has bitten. Because they practice the behavior, and it's highly reinforcing for a dog to make something scary or threatening go away using their teeth. So they'll remember that and say, I'll reach for that again if I need to. So it's always best if you're starting to see growling or stiffening or anything that's concerning, best to hire a professional as soon as possible. And the other thing to do is, while you're waiting for that professional to get there, is avoid putting yourself in that same context. So whatever it was, if it was the dogs fighting because they got fed next to each other, or the dog bit somebody coming into the house because they were startled. Just manage that, avoid that situation for the time being. And at the same time, make notes about the incidents that you are remembering. So the dog growled when the child walked by. And so how far away was the child? What was the dog doing? What was the time of day? And start to take notes. That's going to help the professional, help you as the person needing the help. So those are kind of the top things to do, is just try to get help right away, because some things can be tackled on their own. But when it comes to aggression, it's better not to take that risk of escalating things if you're doing things not quite right. And then managing it to prevent rehearsal of the behavior, and then taking notes for the professional is going to help. I know that helps me a lot.
And what about on the flip side? So I spend a lot of time just reading people's questions and things, and I've often seen that people think that puppies biting is aggression. Is that correct?
Rarely. So yes, puppies can bite using in the sense of they're fearful or they're using their teeth to make somebody go away or something go away. Puppy mouthing behavior, so the dog just jumping up or puppies grabbing at your hands and playfully, that's much different. It's again going back to the underlying motivation. One is play, one is attention seeking. Very normal puppy behavior, especially for some breeds like Malinois or Jack Russells or something. And then you have the other side of the coin is a puppy biting if they're fearful. The body language is going to tell you a lot, plus what you do. So if you move away and the puppy doesn't continue to come towards you and you're seeing the puppy sort of shrink down, tail tucked, growling, moving away on their own as well, that can indicate the dog's worried about what you've been doing. And then on the other side, if they keep following you and they're loose and wiggly and jumping up and darting in and out and being playful, that's puppy mouthing or attention seeking. So two totally different types of behaviors and two totally different types of training too. So,
I find it interesting because I think to a regular dog person, it's the same. Biting's biting.
and it can be painful too. Those little puppy teeth can be sharp. A professional can help you with both, but with puppy mouthing, that's very normal. And oftentimes that as long as you don't do anything to escalate it, that tends to go away on its own when the dog starts to get their adult teeth. And it's one of the common solutions. Just give the puppy something else to put their teeth on. So toys, redirect them to toys, enrichment toys that can be stuffed with food, chewables, that, and allowing them plenty of time to sniff and enjoy the world. Again, meeting the needs, you get rid of problem behaviors.
Things is like Maslow's hierarchy, but for dogs.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, Mike, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our chat.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a great conversation.